Hello and welcome to Pathways, where you are invited to join me for a visit with leaders in personal development and cultural evolution. This is your host, Paul O'Brien. What really makes love last? Does love ever work the way we say it does in movies and books and Facebook posts? Or does obsessing over those love stories hurt our real-life relationships? Our guest this week examines what it means to love someone, to be loved, and how we present our love to the world. Our guest today is Mandy Len Catron, author of the new book, How to Fall in Love with Anyone. Mandy's writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Walrus, as well as literary journals and anthologies. Her TEDx talks can be found at TED.com. She writes about love and love stories at TheLoveStoryProject, TheLoveStoryProject.ca, as in Canada. And she teaches English and creative writing at the University of British Columbia. Her original article, To Fall in Love with Anyone, Do This, was one of the most popular articles published by the New York Times in 2015. Hello, Mandy, and welcome to the Pathways program.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
This book came about after that successful New York Times article about a study that showed how answering from a list of 36 increasingly intimate questions can make a couple fall in love. And then the story of your experience using that questionnaire yourself. Tell us a little bit about how that went.
So I was doing a lot of research about romantic love, and I just wanted to understand it better from a more scientific perspective. And I came across this study that was created by this psychologist named Arthur Aaron. It was from the early 1990s, and basically the goal was to create romantic love in the laboratory. And the way it works is it takes two people and has them ask each other 36 increasingly intimate questions and then stare into each other's eyes for 4 minutes without speaking. And I thought it was pretty interesting, but I was fairly skeptical. So it was one of those things I just filed away in my brain. And a couple of years later, I was out on a date with an acquaintance. And he said to me sort of casually, I have this theory that you could fall in love with anyone. And I thought that was pretty interesting. And I thought, well, I wonder if that's true or not. And I remembered the study. And so I told him about it. And because I thought he was kind of cute, I was like, oh, I've always wanted to try it. And he said, let's do it. And so we did.
And he's your partner today, right?
He is. Yeah.
That's amazing. So this thing really works.
Yeah, but it's important to acknowledge, I think, that really for us, it just made us very close. And right. I didn't know what form that closeness would necessarily take. For a long time, it was just a sort of ambiguous friendship that felt very intimate. And it was probably about 3 months later that we actually started a serious relationship.
I see. So this sounds like a ready-made formula for falling in love. And that's obviously going to be very popular to a lot of people, but tell us why you think that is.
I mean, I think the fact is that everyone wants to feel known. I think we like the idea that there's some shortcut for deeply connecting with another person. And I think that's especially true in the era of online dating, where we have just so many possibilities for meeting new people. But so often those interactions are fairly superficial. And I think people really loved the idea of having a mechanism basically for creating a close, intimate interaction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we don't really get any coaching about that. So this technique stands out for that reason alone. It's probably why you wrote that article about it.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was a really interesting experience, and I just wanted to think about what it meant and what its role was in my own life and my own relationship. And I think there was no way that I could have possibly predicted how intense the response would be. I mean, my feeling was that the whole study really took on a life of its own, that I sort of put it out into the world, and then I just sort of watched it take on its own life, which was a kind of amazing experience.
Well, I love the way that you weaved a book out of that experience, because the book is so much more than just a report on that particular technique or on the results that it had for you. I mean, Your book is kind of a hybrid. It's got a memoir aspect to it also. Now, I would say that the book is about love, and it's also a love story, which is probably where the memoir part comes in. But you're really examining throughout the book what you refer to often as the problem of love. How would you define the problem? What is the problem?
I think the problem is that in our culture, we have this really powerful ideology of love. And that ideology, as far as I can understand it, seems very much rooted in our love stories. And they really suggest like how love should work, and the kind of love that counts is real love, and the kind of love that should be meaningful. And I wanted to think about it a little bit differently, because I felt like those stories weren't serving me very well. And so I decided to basically take a sort of opposite approach, which was like turn to the research. Like, what do scientists know about love, and what do psychologists say, and anthropologists? And I really just wanted to take a more sort of rational, skeptical approach to that process.
Mm-hmm. I like the way that you break it down. You talk about how you had always thought about romantic love, and how it was based on the stories that you had heard and had learned and had read, and that all of us have been exposed to. But one story in particular that was fascinating for you was the story of your own parents and how they came together, which was really kind of a launching point for your exploration. What is it about their story that's intriguing?
So my parents met when my mom was a high school cheerleader. She was 16, and my dad was hired as the new football coach at her high school, and he was 22. And she had to interview him for the high school newspaper. And they became friends kind of right away. And she set him up. So my mom, this all happened in like a rural, tiny Appalachian coal mining town. And my mom was one of 8 children. So she initially set my dad up on a date with her older sister. And the date was like a total disaster. This was a big part of our family mythology. We would always laugh about this date because the two of them, I think my aunt and my dad, seemed like so hilariously incompatible. But eventually my aunt started dating my dad's best friend, who was also a football coach. And my mom started secretly dating my dad. And a few years later, the 4 of them got married in a double wedding. And I think for me, I loved this story growing up because it felt like the kind of story you would see in a movie. And it had this real sense of like, there was this obstacle. He was accidentally dating the wrong sister, and then he finally found the right person. And there was this sense that like fate had brought them together. And it ends with this beautiful happy ending in the double wedding, and everyone sort of paired up with the person that they belonged to. And I think especially because when I was a kid, my dad continued coaching football, and we were at football games every Friday night for basically the first 18 years of my life. And so I felt like it gave me this real sense of like a place in this world. Like I belonged. I was the football coach's daughter, and I eventually became a cheerleader. And so I think this story for me took on this huge, maybe oversized role in my life.
Right. And you have a lot to say in the book about storytelling itself and the importance of storytelling, like how a relationship started, which was kind of a cool way that your parents' story started. And I guess the fact that they ended up getting divorced after, 25 years or 30 years?
8 years of marriage, yeah.
That was quite an eye-opener for you, and maybe had some impetus for you to set off on these explorations because your vision was shattered. Is that true?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it was so difficult for me to deal with their divorce. I really felt as if someone had died. Like I felt this immense sense of grief. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about why that was. And one of the things that I realized was that divorce felt like the wrong ending to their love story. And that sort of led me to think about all the ways in which stories shape how we think about love and what our expectations are. And the biggest one that I struggled with right away was this sense that if you're like a fundamentally good person, excuse me, and you don't do anything to betray your spouse, that more or less guarantees your happiness. And suddenly that wasn't true, and I really decided just to rethink everything.
Right. So this idea that if you are a good person, there's greater odds that love, true love, is in your destiny because you deserve it. You really deconstruct that idea quite successfully. I mean, you talk about your dad telling you that you deserve love, and that really bothered you because it equated love with deservingness, which is that ideology that you're referring to, that deservingness is about feminine goodness.
Yeah, I was on the phone with my dad one day. I was going through a breakup, basically, and he said to me with all the best fatherly intentions, he said, you deserve to be happy. And I just sort of snapped at him, and I look back on it now and think, very unfairly, but I felt so frustrated by that, and I wanted to figure out why it was that bothered me. And I started thinking about this idea that we have in our culture, which is that love is connected to deservingness. And so many of our stories imply that this is true. Like, this is the sort of fundamental idea of Cinderella. Like, she is chosen by the prince because she is, quote unquote, good. And she deserves love as compared to wicked stepsisters who do not. And so I started thinking about, like, what does it mean to deserve love? And it just raised all these complicated issues. Like, one of the ideas is that if people who are loved because they deserve it, then it implies that people who are not loved don't deserve love, which is a really sort of ugly idea if you think about that.
Right.
And I think it really contributes to, like, the stigma of being single in our culture, that, like, if you're single, it must be because you've failed somehow at the goal of coupling, or you've done something wrong. And I really wanted to unpack those ideas.
Right. And you point out that the Cinderella character is not really very admirable in and of herself.
Yeah, if you look at her qualities, I mean, like, she's very meek, she's obedient, she's good at, like, cleaning the house and taking care of people. But otherwise, like, she doesn't have that much going for her. Like, there isn't much apart from, like, kindness to animals about Cinderella that I would want to aspire to, or that I would want my daughter to aspire to if I had a daughter. And yet, if you look at the wicked stepsisters, like, they're ambitious, they're motivated, they have plans. Like, in many ways, they're much more interesting characters. And yet, the story really tells us that this very passive, very mild, obedient idea of femininity is the way to be good, and the way to become noticed, and the way to ultimately be happy. And I think once you start thinking about it that way, it doesn't seem like that satisfying of a story.
Right. No, it was an eye-opener for me. And it kind of ties into a very profound thing that you say in the book that shows how this kind of conditioning affects you and women in general, probably, in our society when it comes to romantic relationships. And that's, you write, when I started my first serious relationship, I didn't notice that my boyfriend's goal was to become an interesting person through having interesting experiences, whereas I hoped to prove my worth by being loved by the most interesting person I knew, which was him.
Yeah, it was an uncomfortable realization for me. And what's really interesting is that a lot of the research confirms this. Like, it's not just my experience. They did a study, these two researchers did a study that found that college-age women who had implicit romantic fantasies, which means fantasies that they weren't explicitly aware of, but they did this sort of implicit test to show that they kind of bought into these ideas on a subconscious level, that these women were less ambitious than their peers, and that they really sort of were motivated to find meaning and success through partnership and through romantic relationships more than through career or their own sort of personal means. But they were seeking happiness and satisfaction through a romantic partner. And I think that is really distressing and also really common. But we don't spend a lot of time unpacking these ideas in these stories. But once you start doing it, you realize like they are really powerful. You know, like Cinderella, the animated version that I grew up watching came out in the 1950s. I think it was like 1950 or 1951. And so if you think about that, it's like, oh, well, of course it would sort of celebrate this very passive, sort of Miss America style of femininity that's about being pretty and good at singing and nice to animals, but not much more complex than that, because that sort of captures this feminine ideal of like the mid 20th century. And yet it was just re-released in live action and not really modernized very much at all just 2 years ago. So it's not like this movie doesn't still have incredible staying power and real prominence in our culture.
Right. You know, I love the way that you said, after going through this exploration and this thought process, quote, I just didn't want to be loved for my goodness anymore. I didn't even really want to be good, unquote. So this was like a turning point for you, right?
I think so, yeah. I think I just had this idea that it was important to be good, and goodness, as I understood it, was really about like pleasing people and being liked. And I had spent my whole life trying to please people and be liked. And I really wanted to rethink what I was doing. And it really occurred to me that, especially in a romantic relationship, if it was my goal to please my partner, that I was never going to be happy. Which doesn't mean that I want to make my partner miserable, but rather I want to think about things a lot more mutually.
Right, right. And then you get into this strange logic of the idea of a soulmate, that there's one right choice or right person or right kind of love, the one. And you say that to believe that such a person exists is to believe that destiny is a real and active force in our lives, and it also means believing that there are wrong people and wrong choices. So accepting both rightness and choice requires simultaneous investment in the forces of fate and free will. Now this is part of that whole romantic ideology that you're talking about, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and what I thought was really interesting about this is, so we're so often talking about the right person or the one, like, oh, he's the one for me, or like, you just haven't met the right woman yet, or whatever. So this is such a part of our language, and once I realized it was such a part of our language, I tried to use this language less frequently. But ultimately, I found it really hard because it is so pervasive that it's difficult to detach ourselves from these ideas, or it has been for me. And then once you really think about that, it also implies that there are wrong people. And if there's a right person and there's a wrong person, and you're trying to find the right person, then you have some choice in the matter, presumably. And it also implies that there's some sort of larger force, whether that's fate or destiny or God or however you want to conceptualize it, that's like bringing the right person to you.
If you deserve it.
If you deserve it, yeah. And so it seems to me that like so many of these ideas, once you dig into them, like logically they don't hold up very well. And I think there's something, for me at least, really satisfying about being able to kind of unpack these ideas and see the logical flaws that are inherent in them, because it takes away some of their power, which gives us more power, which I think is really, well, you know, it feels like a more comfortable way to practice love, something that we have some agency over.
Right, and one of the tools of power, one of the powerful influences upon us all are stories, the stories we tell. And in particular, the narrative of how we met seems to be more important than it should be. And you talk about that. You know, you mentioned somebody who says in the online dating arena, I will lie about how we met. And you show that when a couple relays the narrative of how they met, repeating the story is also a way of establishing their legitimacy of their relationship. But then you point out that the how we met story is becoming less important, or perhaps it should be.
when I was dating, when I was online dating, one of the things that I found was that lots of people, lots of men, would write in their profile some version of the line, "I'm willing to lie about how we met." And I thought, I don't know, it just struck me as really interesting. So I spent a lot of time trying to figure out why someone would feel the need to lie about this and would need to offer that to any potential partners on their dating profile. And I thought either you're really embarrassed about the fact that you've met online. And I feel like in I guess when I was dating, it was like 2014. At this point, like it's so common, the stigma is really gone. So it's either that or you need this really magical story that implies that there are some larger forces at work for your relationship to feel legitimate or valuable. And I think that's really interesting. Like, I think in many ways, the culture of like Hollywood or romantic comedies, or even you can trace it back to like the screwball comedies of the early 20th century, essentially suggest that, the more unlikely the way two people meet, the more serendipitous it feels, then the more magical the fact that they end up being together is. And I think this idea is so interesting. And once I started digging into it, one of the things that I found is that you can actually trace our obsession with the how we met stories in movies back to like the early 1930s, let's say, which was really kind of the beginning of the era in which people started dating, right? Like people didn't really date in the 19th century. They sort of courted and they were brought together by mutual acquaintances or families, and dating wasn't really a thing. Like it was all mediated by usually parents. And so it was really interesting to me that suddenly in our culture, women entered the workforce at the turn of the century and they started meeting men and hanging out in public in unchaperoned ways. And that was really the beginning of this cultural obsession with how we met stories. And then romantic comedies sort of lost a lot of their popularity and cultural power around the turn of the century. And you just don't see that many rom-coms at the box office anymore. And one reason I think that the how we met story is slowly becoming less important is because of online dating. Like I really think it's now so common to hear that people met online. And I like that we're taking a little authority away from this story, because I think for so long we felt like a good story was a clue that it was like a meaningful relationship, or that you were meant to be, or that you were going to be happy together. When actually, if you look at it, there's like no evidence whatsoever that a good story makes a good relationship.
Now, in the book, you highlight two major relationships in your life. The first one, I think it was something like a 10-year relationship. And you say it felt good to know someone as well as we knew each other. It felt good to be known, even if we didn't always like each other that much, even if we forgot our promises to be kind and patient, etc. The prospect of getting to know someone new or of finding someone worth knowing was daunting. Okay, so a lot of the book has to do with you breaking up with Kevin. And then towards the end, the new relationship, after you did the survey thing, and the new relationship started off very slowly as a friendship. How would you break down the difference between these two relationships with people that you obviously liked? What made the difference the second time?
I think the second time I had the benefit of experience and also the benefit of having done several years worth of research on romantic love. And I think both of those things really enabled me to think really long and hard about what I wanted in a relationship. I mean, my relationship with Kevin ended when I was 30. And one of the things that I found was that I really loved being single. And it surprised me because I was so scared of ending that relationship. And the breakup was really hard in many ways. But the surprising sort of benefit of it was that I had this autonomy that felt really freeing, and it was wonderful. And so really, if I was going to give that up, it had to be worth it. And so I really spent a lot of time thinking about the kind of person I wanted to be with and the kind of relationship I wanted to have, and just dating and meeting a lot of different people. And so by the time Mark and I really seriously committed to a relationship, I felt like I knew that he was someone I wanted to invest in. And to me, that was the real difference. It was like I had this sense of agency that I never had when I was younger.
Mm-hmm. There's so much that we could talk about, and we are running out of time. You have so much to say in the book about marriage and why it might be failing, about how other variations are coming into their own, on how some of our most basic assumptions that long-term relationships have to be exclusive, and that exclusivity is part of what gives it value, and how you're questioning all these things. And you sort of describe, you think we need more stories that enlarge love without fetishizing it. How has romantic love become a fetish, and what does that mean?
I think so often our narratives and our cultural discourse treat love as if it is the most profound, most meaningful human experience that you can have. And in many ways, I think it is profound. It does feel profound. But it's also important to remember that it's really ordinary. Like, it is a biological experience. It's culturally determined, but it's also something that many people believe we've evolved to experience, that is like an innate human drive. And so understanding that love is really predictable and it's really ordinary, and though our experiences either with getting to, like, falling in love with someone or breaking up with someone, it feels like this unbelievably unique experience, and that no one has ever felt the intensity of passion that we feel, or the sort of bottomless ache of heartbreak that we've had.
I love the way that you examine things and you break things down and you deconstruct them, and you have so many creative ideas, many of which we have not had a chance to even touch on today. Like the fact that you used a contract at the beginning of your relationship with Mark. I'd like to see a whole book about that. That was fascinating. And then you have a chapter towards the end entitled "The Pleasures of Ordinary Devotion." What a lovely concept. But we've got to go. We're out of time here, Mandy. And I want to make sure to tell our listeners about your website, which is MandyLenCatron.com. It's all one word. Mandy, MandyLenCatron. MandyLenCatron.com, and people can find about your books and your work in general there, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Hey, well, thank you, Mandy. There's so much more we could explore. What a great book. Thank you for writing it, but we have run out of time.
Thanks for having me. It's so fun.
And for those who tuned in late, this is your Pathways host, Paul O'Brien, author of Great Decisions, Perfect Timing, a book that shares the theme of Pathways, which is personal and cultural evolution. In a second, I'll tell you how you can rewind and replay this interview anytime you like via the internet or as a free podcast. Just search for Pathways or Paul O'Brien and you can find it. Today we have been visiting with Mandy Len Catron, author of How to Fall in Love with Anyone. I want to say thank you to all of our listeners for tuning into the Pathways program, which is broadcast and streamed worldwide via KBOO.FM Sunday mornings at 8:30 USA Pacific Time. Podcasts of today's show, which you can listen to and forward to others, are available for free at divination.com, spelled D-I-V-I nation.com, as well as via iTunes and other free podcast servers. This is Paul O'Brien, reminding you to tell your friends about Pathways Radio and Podcasts. And thanks again to Mandy Len Catron and to all of you listeners for tuning in and being a part of the Pathways experience.